Hey everyone, and a huge, heartfelt welcome to the channel. Seriously, wherever you are right now, thank you so much for joining me. Before we dive into today's heavy but fascinating topic, I genuinely hope you're feeling strong, healthy, and surrounded by good vibes. Sending you all the positive energy. Okay, let's get started. Picture Europe in the mid-1300s. Life is tough but predictable. Peasants work the land for their lords, crowded cities bustle, and the church holds immense power. Then, disaster strikes. A terrifying, invisible enemy arrives on trading ships. Within a few horrifying years, it wipes out not just a town or a city, but an estimated 1/3 to even half of the entire population of Europe. We're talking about 25 million people or more. Imagine losing nearly half the people you know, family, friends, neighbors, leaders, in a terrifyingly short time. This was the Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in human history. And here's the shocking truth. This unimaginable tragedy didn't just cause suffering, it completely shattered the medieval world and accidentally built the foundations of the modern Europe we know today. Stick with me, because the ways this plague changed everything, from how much workers got paid to what people believed about God, are absolutely mind-blowing. So, what exactly was this monster? We know now it was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas living on rats. But back then, people were clueless and terrified. It arrived in Europe around 1347, likely via Genoese trading ships coming from the Black Sea. Once it hit land, it spread like wildfire, faster than anyone could understand or stop. There were three main forms, and all were horrific. Bubonic plague was the most common. Victims developed agonizingly painful, egg-sized or even apple-sized swellings called buboes in their groin, armpits, or neck, accompanied by fever, chills, vomiting, and terrible aches. Death often came within a week. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs, causing victims to cough up blood. It was even deadlier and spread directly through the air when people coughed. Septicemic plague poisoned the bloodstream, turning skin dark purple or black, where the name Black Death likely comes from, and killing people often within hours. Imagine the sheer terror, healthy one day, covered in hideous boils or coughing blood the next, dead soon after. Doctors were powerless, armed with useless cures like bloodletting, potions made of crushed emeralds, or holding sweet-smelling herbs to the nose. The famous plague doctor, beak masks came later. Panic was everywhere. People watched loved ones die in agony. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Towns smelled of death and despair. It was a real-life apocalypse. The immediate impact was pure chaos and societal collapse. Think about it, losing up to half the population almost overnight. Whole villages simply vanished, abandoned as everyone died or fled. Fields lay empty and unplanted. Animals roamed untended. Cities became ghost towns. Who was left to grow the food? Who was left to make the clothes, build the houses, run the shops, enforce the laws, or lead the communities? The sheer scale of death shattered the very fabric of everyday life. Trade ground to a halt as merchants died and ports shut down out of fear. Governments, from local lords to kings, were paralyzed. Many officials and nobles died too. Law and order broke down in many places. Fear and suspicion ran rampant. People desperately searched for someone to blame. Sadly, this often led to horrific violence against minorities. Jewish communities, in particular, faced brutal pogroms, massacres fueled by vicious rumors that they had poisoned the wells. Lepers, foreigners, beggars, and anyone deemed different were also targeted. This period was marked by unimaginable grief, paralyzing fear, and a terrifying breakdown of the social order that had held medieval Europe together for centuries. The old rules simply didn't apply anymore in a world suddenly so empty. But here's where things get incredibly surprising. Out of this utter devastation emerged something nobody expected: power for the common people. Before the plague, Europe ran on a system called feudalism. At the bottom were the peasants, or serfs. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. They were tied to the land owned by a lord. In exchange for protection and a small plot to grow their own food, they had to work the lord's fields for free several days a week, pay hefty taxes, often in grain or livestock, and couldn't leave the manor without permission. They had very little bargaining power, life was hard, and there were always more people than jobs. But the Black Death flipped this upside down. Suddenly, there were vastly fewer workers, but just as much land that needed farming and just as much work that needed doing. Lords were desperate. Their fields were empty, their income vanishing. For the peasants and laborers who survived, this was a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. They realized their work was now incredibly valuable. They started demanding higher wages and better working conditions. They wanted actual money, not just scraps. They wanted to be paid for all their work, not spend most of their week working for free for the Lord. If one lord refused, they could literally just walk away to the next manor over, where a desperate lord would happily offer them a better deal. This was revolutionary. Serfs started buying their freedom or simply leaving their old manors behind. The old system where lords could command cheap, tied-down labor was crumbling. The ruling classes, of course, freaked out. They tried to pass laws to freeze everything in place, to force wages back down to pre-plague levels and stop peasants from moving around. These were called ordinances, and later the Statute of Laborers, in England. Kings and nobles essentially said, "No, you cannot ask for more money. Go back to working for pennies like before." But it was almost impossible to enforce. There simply weren't enough officials, and the workers held the real power now because they were so scarce. Imagine trying to force someone to work for half price when 5 other employers are begging to pay them double. These laws largely failed, creating massive resentment. Peasant anger over these unfair laws, combined with new taxes imposed by kings fighting expensive wars, like the 100 Years' War, eventually exploded. We saw massive peasant revolts across Europe in the decades following the plague. The most famous was the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by figures like Wat Tyler. Tens of thousands of armed peasants marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, fairer laws, and lower taxes. While brutally suppressed, these revolts sent a clear message: the old ways were gone. The balance of power had shifted permanently. Feudalism, as it had existed, was dying. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed an entire economic and social system, paving the way for a more market-driven economy where labor had real value. It was the beginning of the end for serfdom in Western Europe. The plague also delivered a massive blow to the most powerful institution of the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church. Before 1347, the Church held almost unquestioned authority. It explained the world, provided comfort, and controlled people's path to salvation. People trusted it completely. But the Black Death shattered that trust in profound ways. First, the Church's explanations failed miserably. Priests preached that the plague was God's punishment for sin. People repented desperately, prayed, went on pilgrimages, gave money to the Church, but the dying continued relentlessly. Why were devout priests, nuns, bishops, and even the Pope's own doctor dying horrible deaths if this was simply about sin? Why did God not protect his most faithful servants? This caused a deep crisis of faith. Second, the Church's response was often shameful. Many parish priests, terrified for their own lives, abandoned their flocks, refusing to perform last rites, a crucial sacrament for salvation in the medieval mind. Bishops fled their cities. The church hierarchy looked cowardly and self-serving. This vacuum of spiritual leadership and failure opened the door for extreme movements. The most disturbing were the flagellants. These were groups of people who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with metal-tipped scourges until they bled, believing this extreme self-punishment could appease God's wrath and stop the plague. They were often fanatical and sometimes violent, attacking Jews and clergy who opposed them. The Church eventually condemned them, but their existence showed how deep the desperation and loss of faith in the official Church had become. While the Church remained powerful, its absolute moral and spiritual authority was cracked. People started looking for answers outside the traditional church structure, questioning its teachings and practices. This planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into movements like the Reformation centuries later. The constant shadow of death fundamentally changed how people thought about life itself. Before the plague, medieval art and literature often focused on religious themes, the afterlife, and the glory of God. Think beautiful stained glass windows and illuminated manuscripts of saints. But after experiencing such widespread, sudden, and gruesome death, a new, darker theme emerged: the omnipresence of death and the fragility of life. This obsession gave birth to one of the most iconic artistic motifs of the late Middle Ages, the danse macabre, or the dance of death. This appeared in paintings, frescoes, woodcuts, poems, and plays. It depicted death, often as a grinning skeleton, leading people from all walks of life: popes, emperors, kings, queens, knights, merchants, peasants, young, old, in a dance to the grave. The message was stark and universal: death comes for everyone, rich or poor, powerful or weak. Your earthly status means nothing in the end. It was a constant, grim reminder of mortality. Alongside this, art became more realistic and sometimes more grotesque in depicting suffering and decay. Tomb sculptures showed rotting corpses or skeletons, not just idealized figures of the deceased. This wasn't just about being morbid, it was a profound shift in consciousness. People became acutely aware of how short and unpredictable life could be. This awareness had a flip side: it encouraged some to focus more intensely on living well in the present. If death could strike at any moment, why wait to enjoy life? Why suffer needlessly under old restrictions? This contributed to a growing sense of individualism and a questioning of traditional hierarchies, feeding into the social and economic changes already underway. The experience of mass death made life feel both cheaper and more precious at the same time. Economically, the shockwaves of the plague completely reshaped Europe. We've talked about the labor shortage boosting workers' wages, but the effects went much deeper. With so many people gone, demand for basic goods like food initially plummeted, causing prices to drop temporarily. But as populations slowly started to recover, though it took over a century in many places, and as survivors suddenly found themselves with more money, from higher wages or inheriting property from dead relatives, demand for better things increased. People didn't just want to survive, they wanted nicer clothes, better food, finer household goods. This surge in demand for quality goods, combined with the scarcity of skilled labor, actually spurred innovation. Why? Because landowners and business owners needed to produce more with fewer people. They started looking for ways to be more efficient. This encouraged investment in new technologies and methods. For example, there was a push towards more sheep farming, which required fewer laborers than crop farming, to meet the booming demand for wool and cloth. This shift had massive long-term consequences. Landowners began enclosing common lands, used by peasants for grazing, for their own sheep pastures, displacing villagers, an early sign of changing land use priorities. The labor shortage also accelerated the adoption of labor-saving devices where possible. While the full Industrial Revolution was centuries away, the pressure to do more with less started building. Furthermore, the concentration of wealth in fewer hands, as survivors inherited, and the increased wages for workers created a larger class of people with money to spend beyond mere subsistence. This helped fuel the growth of a more diversified economy and a stronger middle class of merchants and skilled artisans in towns. The rigid, land-based economy of feudalism was giving way to something more dynamic, cash-based, and market-oriented. The plague, devastating as it was, accidentally kicked off Europe's first steps towards a more modern capitalist economy. Even in the grim shadow of death, life and science stumbled forward, though often in messy ways. The utter failure of traditional medicine, doctors in creepy bird masks blowing smoke up your rear end wasn't exactly cutting edge, forced people to confront their ignorance. While true understanding of germ theory was centuries away, the plague sparked a slow, painful shift towards more observation-based approaches. Some began to question ancient authorities like Galen, whose theories clearly hadn't worked. There was a greater, albeit hesitant, focus on public health measures, even if they were crude. Italian city-states like Venice and Milan pioneered the concept of quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving from infected areas had to wait offshore for 40 days before anyone could disembark. Towns might try to wall themselves off or restrict movement. While these measures were often inconsistent and implemented too late, they represented a dawning recognition that disease might spread through contact, not just through bad air, miasma, or divine punishment. The sheer scale of death also had a massively practical side. It provided more opportunities for dissection and the study of anatomy, though this was still controversial and limited. The experience highlighted the need for better urban sanitation and water supplies, though progress was slow. On a deeper level, the plague intensified the human desire to understand and control the natural world, planting seeds that would eventually grow into the scientific revolution. People desperately wanted answers, and the old ones had proven catastrophically inadequate. The long-term consequences of the Black Death echo right down to our world today. It fundamentally accelerated the decline of feudalism and the rise of a money-based economy and early capitalism. The empowerment of laborers was a crucial step towards modern labor relations. The weakening of the Church's absolute authority created space for new ideas, secular thought, and eventually the Renaissance and Reformation. The growth of cities accelerated as survivors moved for better opportunities, and a stronger middle class began to emerge. Culturally, the focus on individual experience and the fragility of life fostered by the plague contributed to the humanist ideas that blossomed in the Renaissance. The map of Europe changed too. Some regions, like parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, saw a slower decline in serfdom initially, sometimes even a strengthening as nobles clamped down harder to maintain control. But the overall trajectory in Western Europe was towards greater freedom and mobility for the common person. Even our language was shaped by it. The word plague itself comes from this era, and countless folk tales and expressions reflect the deep trauma. The Black Death wasn't just a historical event, it was Europe's biggest reset button. It tore down a creaking old system and, through unimaginable suffering, forced the continent onto a radically new path, a path that led, eventually, to the modern world. It proved that humans could adapt and rebuild even after the worst imaginable catastrophe. So, next time you think about workers' rights, the power of supply and demand, the questioning of old authorities, or even just the preciousness of life, remember the shadow of the Black Death. It's a stark reminder of how profoundly a single event can change the course of history, forging something new and unexpected from the ashes of the old. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. If this deep dive into history's darkest hour gave you a new perspective, give the video a thumbs up, subscribe for more journeys into the past, and let me know in the comments what shocked you the most. Take care of yourselves and each other. Stay curious, stay resilient, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.